The death penalty is a just punishment for the unjustified taking of innocent human life under specific circumstances, which play out as the most grievous or heinous of circumstances when compared to other first-degree murders.
I don't think it serves any rational purpose any longer, if it ever did, that there are too many chances for error.
The death penalty is wrong. It's destructive. It's destructive to people and societies and cultures, and the whole witness of the faith community as well as the medical community says you must not do this.
Only 23 countries executed people in 2016, including the U.S. The death penalty is banned in 19 states in the U.S. Only 14 states imposed the death sentence in 2016. 10 counties in the U.S. imposed the majority of death sentences. 20 people were executed in 2016 in the U.S. That's a 25-year low. More than 150 people sent to death row were exonerated. There are 120 prisoners on Arizona's death row. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled that juveniles and persons with intellectual disabilities do not possess the requisite moral culpability and therefore cannot be executed. Yet defendants with diminished culpability, similar to categorically exempted defendants, fall through the cracks of justice. Borderline intellectual functioning, IQs in the 70s and low 80s, youth, ages 18 to 21 years, people with extreme childhood trauma, including physical or sexual abuse, those with fetal alcohol syndrome, and people with substance abuse disorders.
It was clear to me that death penalty was not the right answer, and I don't think it is the right answer, period. When we have someone who's killed somebody, why is it okay for us to kill somebody because they killed somebody? It doesn't make sense morally, ethically, any way you want to cut it.
The incredible distortion of Scripture and faith when people quote small passages from the Torah or from Hebrew Scriptures, like an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, is just bad Bible.
One argument that's given against the death penalty very frequently is, why would we kill someone to show that killing people is wrong? And I think that's oversimplified in that there's a difference between killing someone out of anger or killing someone out of greed as an individual and the societal institution of the death penalty that's engaged in many other kinds of commitments. There are many other kinds of reasons. That said, I think everyone believes that killing a human being is a bad thing and it needs some really strong justification. So what sort of justification can we give for it? The two most common kinds of justification are justice and retribution and deterrence. The justice and retribution view is that if someone does something wrong, they deserve to be punished for it. Just as if someone does something right, they deserve to be praised for it. And that justice means giving people what they deserve. And I think the idea is if someone does something wrong, in a sense, something in the universe has been bent out of whack, and we need to bend it back into shape.
It is a morally defensible position to pursue the death penalty against those defendants who have committed a heinous offense and who fall within one of those 14 factors and whose identity and participation can be ascertained and that we can prove beyond a reasonable doubt. And that when you balance the mitigation evidence presented against the facts and circumstances of the offense, it's appropriate to pursue the death penalty.
The death penalty laws actually go back to 18th century BC as part of the Code of King Hammurabi of Babylon. And there were many offenses at that time that were considered capital offenses. As far as why it has been so embedded in the United States, I guess we can look to Britain for that, because Britain had a very expansive death penalty. As a matter of fact, I think it was as many as 222 crimes at one point in the 1700s were considered capital offenses. And so when British came to the United States and created the colonies here, they brought with them a practice of capital punishment. And so when the colonies were developed, created, death penalty became part of the criminal laws of the colonies. And it just continued once we became independent and states started to come into creation with their own laws, and most of them at that point then had the death penalty.
Not every homicide is a first-degree murder. Not every first-degree murder is a death penalty case. And in reviewing those types of cases, what we have to look at in the first instance is, do we have evidence that leads us to believe as prosecutors that a jury is going to agree with us unanimously 12-0 that we have proven someone's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Close questions of guilt, we do not file the death penalty in.
Statistics have shown that someone is more likely to be sentenced to death and put to death if they are black and it's a black perpetuating a capital crime against a white person. And until that inequity is resolved, the death penalty is unfair. The way it's applied across the board is unfair.
In fact, the people who end up on death row are typically the most downtrodden, mentally ill, unfortunate people in our society. Typically, I mean, they're all poor. Rich people don't end up on death row. Generally, white people don't end up on death row, at least not nearly at the rate of minorities, ethnic minorities, and it also depends a great deal on who you kill. If you kill a white person, you're much more likely to be prosecuted capitally than if you kill a black person. It's not the worst of the worst. It's typically the minorities, the ones with the worst lawyers, and it also has a lot to do with just where you happen to commit the crime. Most death penalties now come from 10 counties in the United States, one of which is Maricopa County here in Arizona.
People who make that argument have to make it nationally. They can't make it for Arizona. On our death row, 58% of those who are facing the death penalty are Caucasian. About 24% are Hispanic, and about 14% are African American. So you can't say, well, I guess you could say that if we're racially motivated to impose a death penalty against Caucasians, that would be a factor, but that's ludicrous. So most of the times when you hear various arguments about the death penalty, that's looking at national numbers, and it's taking an argument about the death penalty and elevating it above what we have to consider in Arizona, and trying to confuse the circumstances by invoking what's going on in other states.
The rationale for having it at the moment, and the only one that makes any sense, is deterrence. But my observation is that it does not really serve a deterrent effect for several reasons. First of all, a great many, if not the great majority, of killings, of murders, are the result of frenzy induced in part or in whole by drugs, and I include alcohol as a drug. So people aren't thinking rationally when they commit these crimes. A great many of them are not. So there's no deterrent effect to people like that.
80% of the executions are in the South in the United States, but the South has the highest murder rate. And then you take the northeast part of the United States, where only 1% of executions occur. They have the lowest murder rate. So I think there's a question of whether it really is a deterrent.
I can tell you that in 2012, when Arizona carried out 6 executions, Each one of those executions resulted in a lockdown of the Florence facility, meaning everyone who was imprisoned there, regardless of whether they were there for a homicide, was aware that the death penalty was being carried out. And I dare say that at least for that particular population, there's a deterrent effect.
Is it cruel and unusual punishment, and does it violate the 14th Amendment due process requirement, given all of the problems of determining who should live and who should die, all of the problems with inequality, with lack of uniform standards, all of the problems I mentioned. So I think that this issue will continue to come to the U.S. Supreme Court, and what they will do, I don't know.
Well, traditionally, physicians have not had anything to do with executions, and certainly the AMA has a very strong position against it, and if you go back to the Hippocratic Oath, it's very clear there not to do harm. It's very clear that the physician will not give a lethal injection. And the fundamental idea is that the profession of being a physician is such an awesome responsibility, and the powers are so great that we have to have an incredibly strong commitment to use those powers only to heal and not to kill. And that's been the traditional view. On the other hand, there are some physicians who disagree. There are some physicians who think that it is consistent with medical ethics. And some of those physicians are perhaps opposed to the death penalty in general, but believe that if the death penalty is occurring, even if we think it shouldn't occur, but if it is occurring, I as a physician have some kind of obligation to relieve suffering. And relieving suffering means helping make sure as much as I can that this execution is done painlessly.
They took the media representatives into a separate room to start with and tried to give us a preview of what to expect. And they told us that what we were going to witness was going to be similar to a heart attack, somebody having a heart attack. Well, in one of my prior lives, I was a fire department EMT, and I've dealt with a lot of people dying of heart attacks. What I saw that day was not a heart attack. There was no way that was even close to a heart attack. This was more like a suffocation. And asphyxiation is really what he died from. And so they take you in, and you're sort of facing this giant metal bell jar. It's kind of like something you'd see in a submarine. And it was, our view was blocked by some Venetian blinds, and there was this kind of dull light behind it. And then when everybody was set, they opened up these Venetian blinds, they kind of pulled them up, and here was Walter Legrand already strapped into the chair, and his back was basically to us. Wasn't wearing a hood or anything like that, and he was kind of reaching around looking, and off to one side was the widow of the man, the bank manager that he killed. And she was standing there looking through a window at him and holding his picture so that Walter Legrand could see the man that he killed. Walter is strapped to it. He's got leather straps around his wrists, and he's sitting there. And what happens in the gas chamber is they release a lever, and these cyanide tablets drop into a vat of acid that's below the chair. And that's what makes the cyanide gas. And this gray mist started to appear around his feet, and the negative pressure inside created by this little fan started pulling it up. And as this mist started rising up, he was rising up. He was trying to get above it, and he started to choke and gasp, and he was kind of thrashing around a bit, and you just see that he was just trying to get above it, and he couldn't, and he was choking and gasping, and eventually he kind of slumped down, and he just sort of dropped his head, and we could see him still breathing from behind him. We could still see that he was breathing, and then that slowly stopped. By this time, this fog was just sort of enveloped him. And we just stood there quietly for what seemed like an eternity. And then the Venetian blinds dropped, and it was over.
And I'm thinking, okay, well, this is just like the other ones I've seen, and they're going to come in 10 minutes and it's going to be over. That's not what happened. He started kind of gulping for air. His mouth started opening and closing. And I thought after about 15 minutes, I thought to myself, well, this is not, this is ugly. But execution's not pretty, and that's whatever.
Right.
He'll be done soon. And then it goes into half an hour, and then it goes into 45 minutes. Then it goes into an hour. And then an hour and 15 minutes. I'm still thinking, an hour and a half. And I remember at an hour and a half, I wrote a note down in my little notebook, but I remember thinking to myself, what happens if they can't kill this guy? I mean, are we at the point where they can't do it? I mean, I'm thinking after an hour and a half, whatever drugs they pumped into him, they've got to be pumping more or whatever, and nothing's going on. But about 10 minutes later, he stopped doing it, and it was over at that point.
I think what gets lost in the shuffle, unfortunately, and quite tragically in the death penalty conversations are the victims. The victims and their families who have suffered an unspeakable loss. And I would like to see their names known as well as some of these horrific murderers that we hear so much about in the media.
So my twin sister, her name was Carrie Johnson, was murdered in 2011. Actually, January 11th, 2011. It was 3 days after the Gabby was shot. She was in Prescott, Arizona, and she was murdered by a boyfriend that apparently was mentally ill. The guy that killed her was not competent, so we went through several years and hearings and stuff of going through competency hearings, and I think he was finally sentenced to 44 years at the Arizona State Hospital. He actually pled finally.
A lot of people or advocates will say after the trial is over, if there is a trial, if it is solved and there is a person arrested, that closure comes when the trial's over. And that in reality, there's no closure. After the trial is over, you focus, because you've been focusing up to that point on the trial and on justice, then it's time to grieve.
Jesus of Nazareth made it very clear, and then the earliest church in the Christian tradition was very clear in the book of Romans. You cannot take vengeance. You cannot avenge yourself, anyone who claims to be a person of faith.
I used to support the death penalty. I thought they got it right. It wasn't going to affect me. What did I care? Well, now it did affect me, and I do care. There was a murder of a local barmaid found stabbed to death in the men's bathroom of a bar that I played volleyball for and darts for. She had been found with no clothes on, and there was a bite mark on her breast. There was no evidence of robbery, no sign of a break-in, so the police initiated an investigation on the assumption it had to be somebody that knew her. Of course, they questioned her coworkers. One of them mentioned me as a boyfriend. The police came to my house, told them it wasn't a boyfriend. I only knew her from the bar. In the next 2 days, they questioned me, noticed that I had a protruding tooth in the front, a result of a car accident back when I was young. Just 2 days after the murder, a local medical examiner told them that my teeth matched the mark on the body, and I was arrested. I worked for the post office. I had my own home, but I didn't have the hundreds of thousands of dollars it costs for an attorney. But most important, I was innocent, didn't think I had anything to worry about. Of course, that probably made me the most vulnerable. I was given a court-appointed attorney who was granted $5,000 payment for defending me. The trial started just 7 months after my arrest. I was charged with murder, kidnapping, and sexual assault. The prosecutor, Noel Levy, there in Phoenix, had brought in a bite mark expert who testified that marks in the body matched my teeth, that my teeth were unique as a result of the car accident, that those marks on her body happened at the time of her death, and that made me Ray Crone the murderer. It was just a 3.5-day trial, mostly the police and prosecution. I took the stand. My roommate took the stand, who was living with me, knew I was home that night. Nevertheless, the prosecutor told the jury that he would lie to protect me, and in just 3 hours, the jury found me guilty of murder and kidnapping. And there's nothing in life that prepares you. Now, I was just a few weeks shy of being 35 years old at the time of my arrest. So I've been through some things in life, but I had been in trouble with the law. I had 7 years with the post office, 6 years with the honorable discharge from the military. This stuff doesn't happen You know, not that nobody I ever knew it happened to, and so you're in a complete daze. You trusted the system, you fought for your country, you worked for your country, and here people were just lying. The system didn't care. You had you thought a perfect defense when you're home in bed, and your lawyer doesn't do anything, and there's a jury looking at you, calling you a murderer, a rapist, and a monster. I was labeled a snaggletooth killer. It's like I stepped into an alternate world. You know, it just was unbelievable. And again, to trust the system to work it out, and in just 3 hours they find me guilty, and I'm facing the death penalty. I was then sentenced to death because the time it came to show remorse. How do you show remorse for something you didn't do? I find no fault with the jurors, none whatsoever. I recognize that they can only act on what they're told. Now we all have our own personal prejudice. That's true.
Well, initially, you know, we all thought we did the right thing. We listened to the evidence. We found that, you know, the defendant was guilty based upon the evidence, obviously, and we just went upon our life and did, you know, continued on, and then approximately 10 years later, you know, I get a call from a friend of mine, and she said that Ray Crone had been exonerated, and I couldn't understand why that could happen, but she said that DNA evidence had exonerated him, and I felt absolutely devastated by that, because, you know, here it was, an innocent man that had 10 years of his life gone, and through no fault of his own, and on a very substantial or circumstantial case. So it was just it was difficult for me to come to grips with that. I felt bad for Ray more than anything, but I also felt I carried a lot of guilt as a result, and so that was difficult to process.
What happens is that you have police, even good police that are trying to do their jobs. They have too many cases, they get tunnel vision. Someone looks like the likeliest suspect, so that's the avenue that they follow. And then the state public defender's office, horribly overburdened, 1 million cases. They don't have the funding or the time to fully investigate a case. So again, mistakes are made, and along the way, they pile up. People doing post-conviction work, some of them are very good attorneys, but they're not getting the funding and the resources that they need from the courts. So it's a broken system, and until it's fixed, the death penalty shouldn't move forward.
It has a terrible fault. It is administered by human beings, okay? So it makes mistakes, which is one reason I think we should abolish the death penalty. It's founded upon the work of district attorneys and county attorneys, all of whom are human too, which have their work based usually on the work of police officers, all of whom are human too. And it all comes up to a trial before a judge and jury, all of whom are human too. And the final say-so is by appellate judges, all of whom are human too. So you got how many chances of making mistakes have I enumerated here?
Executing an innocent person is a worse injustice than not executing a guilty person. If society is active in taking the life of an innocent person, the injustice of that is something that is worse than the injustice of having a guilty person not be put to death.
Well, we adopted a little boy when he was 14 months old. We didn't know any information about him. And in 1989, after he'd been in kid prison a couple of times, he committed a horrific crime here in Pima County. He killed 2 people, 2 80-year-old people. And he was given the death penalty in 1991, and you know, our family's lives just were shattered, as well as his life. And he'd had problems all the time growing up, and we'd taken him places to try to get help. He'd been a number of psychologists, counselors, and nobody could ever kind of figure out what the problems were. He was doing things like stealing, lying, had trouble learning, and so on and so forth. Never been violent. And I think the whole incident that happened in the Sherrill's home was an anomaly, but it was a horrible, horrible thing. And he was under a lot of pressure. So it wasn't until later, until he was sentenced to death, I went back and was able to actually meet his birth mother. Turned out she was 17, drinking, and drinking while she was pregnant, and owned up to that. So I was hoping we'd get the death penalty overturned by that alone. However, that same year that I located her, there was a man in California who was executed who had fetal alcohol syndrome. So we got together a group of people. We got Carla Ryan, who's an outstanding appellate attorney, and got a lot of experts. And so in 1997, thanks to the Supreme Court remanding, the Arizona Supreme Court remanding his sentence for resentencing, because of what they called red flags, we were able to get the death penalty overturned, and it was the first time really in legal history that genetics was a mitigating factor, as well as FAS, and there were a number of other things. So now John has a sentence of life in prison.
There's so many arbitrary factors. I mean, often people who commit the most hideous and heinous crimes are the ones who are most mentally ill, or who were most abused as children, or who have just brain damage, or, you know, they're the people that really we fail. Our society fails, and that's why they end up where they are.
If any of the circumstances that have been addressed about the situation that homicide defendants are in was a causal factor, we should see more homicides. The fact that we don't is an indication that there is something else at play here, and by and large, it's going to be someone made a choice for which they need to be held accountable.
Part of the problem with people with FAS is they don't have a corpus callosum that's connected between the right and the left, so emotions don't necessarily get to intellect, and remorse is not something they come by easily. So basically, John and others like him need an external brain.
In the case of the Tucson shooting, I do believe that there could have been a way to prevent it, and I'll tell you what I think it is. The shooter was displaying pretty erratic behavior for at least 2 years before the shooting, including a video that he put up online where he panned the camera around Pima College and called it his genocide school. That should have been a red flag. It kind of was to the Pima College Police, but they didn't take the step that I think would have perhaps prevented it. And that step is when you see somebody with those kinds of behaviors or intentions, dangerous to self and dangerous to others under the legal term, you can refer them to the county attorney's office for involuntary treatment. That could have happened, and had it happened, I believe the shooting could have been prevented.
I don't think that there's ever healing from the victims that I've spoken to. This is a loss that is immeasurable and irreparable. But knowing that there is justice, knowing that our society values life above all else, and that if you take a life, you are going to pay the ultimate price, I think that that does give some very minimal comfort to the victims.
Now, this pop psychology term closure is just another term for revenge, and that never helps people heal or move ahead or develop spiritually or ethically.
I had hoped that we could have a plea bargain where he confessed and took responsibility. He did. That's closure for me. And the fact that there's a young man who's 22 years old, you know, he's never going to see life outside of a prison. He'll die there. I would think, quite frankly, if you're looking for revenge, which I'm not looking for, having someone in a prison that young for perhaps 40, 50 years, 60 years maybe, that's a big time punishment, you know. no connection to family or friends, no ability to be on the outside. Every day is regimented, I think that's pretty cruel punishment in and of itself, and that's more than enough for me.